Chapter 6 Spring of a Moldavian Sun. I arrived at the first destination of my journey last summer, Bucharest's Henry Coandă International Airport. Getting to where I needed to go required a connection to Suceava Stefan cel Mare International Airport in Suceava, Romania. Disembarking from the plane, I made my way through the maze of passengers to pick up my bags and find a good spot to wait for the rest of the crew to arrive. The destination of the third leg was Castle cel Tradut, as Cheesy called it. The cel Tradut family home was high in the Carpathian Mountains deep in the forest. I wasn't about to get lost in this one-building airport nor miss anyone arriving, so I acquired a beverage and settled in for the wait. We had to travel about 60 km from this airport, and that should take about an hour in normal traffic, or so I was told. While sitting on the bench I wondered why I was in Romania and not Moldavia. I would have to ask the Jacks, I thought. A young man was performing tricks for a couple of travelers on the next bench. He was quite good based on their reaction and from what I could see from my vantage point. I stifled the urge to go over and watch because I thought he would probably migrate in this direction as my group grew in size. Cheesy was the first to arrive from California, where he was attending California State and living at the Salton Seaside with the Jacks. We had a bit of catching up to do, so we were busy talking when Ian, Richard and Sandy arrived together. They arrived from New Delhi, where Ian had taken an extra week to make a stop in India and visit the house Sir Malcolm left him. In reality, he wanted to take another look for the diaries based on something his father had mentioned to him. Richard was staying at the house at the time, and when he heard where Ian was going, he begged to come along. Ian talked to me about bringing Richard to Moldavia. We knew he would be snooping through their house given half a chance, so Ian had a candid conversation with Uncle Sandu to make his concerns known, but also extol the benefits of bringing Richard. Uncle Sandu replied he would have better luck breaking into the Vatican, and was not concerned, but he was grateful to be duly warned. Then Ian told me he said something profound. The value of advice is determined by the receiver. I see value in all advice, but enhance that value by the value of the source. I thank you, my friend. When we had a moment, he told us, father was in Nainital once that I know of with Sir Malcolm. It was in the early 70s, I believe. Sir Malcolm brought my father to India because his passion, at that time, was photography. Father wanted to get some pictures of big Indian cats to go with the images of cats he had taken in Africa the year before. Did you find the diaries? I had to ask. No, was the response. Then Cheesy and Sandy sat down, and he continued, I did find a few other items. There was a Chinese puzzle box in a chest that he had stored in the basement. I know there is something in it, but it's a very elaborate puzzle box that looks extremely old. And you didn't look inside? Cheesy asked, and Sandy tilted his head and shrugged his shoulders like he had already asked Ian that. It's just wood, isn't it? Well, the box is obviously old. I don't know how old it is or if it's from an ancient Chinese dynasty. It could be a piece of artwork by a local artisan. The beauty of the intricate carvings prevents me from destroying it in either case. I brought the box with me so any of you that are inclined can solve the box puzzle if you wish. I've read about boxes such as these, which may require up to 1,000 moves such as a push, twist or pull on a panel or inset. I would prefer not to destroy it. In fact, anyone who can open it will get 2 weeks at Christmas in Nainital, my treat. Sandy added, I've heard that in the dynastic period of China, they would have these types of treasure storage boxes trapped somehow. Not necessarily to stop the rightful owner who could open it without danger with the proper solution, but to destroy the object rather than let it fall into the hands of those who may try but fail. A vial of acid may destroy the contents, or friction will set it ablaze. They can be lead-lined if important enough, although I have heard of more mystical ways of cloaking the contents as well. Ian added, I talked to my father about the box because I thought he may know where I could find the solution to it or whether he had even seen it before. He knew nothing of the box but gave me a few other places to look in the house for some of Sir Malcolm's artifacts. A few letters Sir Malcolm received from various people over the years were in a box. They all turned out to be from England, and many of them were relatives asking for money. A few trinkets were in the box, which was silver-lined and more than 1 meter in every direction. A silver frame and some old pictures that must have been from the time of the invention of the camera. Most were wildlife photos from India that included elephants carrying passengers. I imagine they were famous or royal. Some temples and shrines were shown with locals standing in front of them. They looked to be impressive individuals, but I have no idea who they could have been. It would be nice to have someone try and locate these shrines and perhaps identify some of the individuals. Perhaps that would be a good path to set Richard on. There was lots of that type of paraphernalia in the box. I found the box on the morning I left for Sandy's, so I'm not sure I did a thorough job of it. I left everything in India and just brought the puzzle box. Dick and Dr. Sue arrived at the same time. Dick met up with Dr. Sue at the Bucharest airport on the connecting flight. She was so excited about this trip. As a child, she didn't get the opportunity to travel much. By the age of 18, she already had her bachelor's degree and was a fast-rising prodigy in her field. With both parents being doctors, her path was inevitable, and etched in stone by her first private tutor. She took the exciting post in Africa only to find more insulation in her life than ever before. Now at almost 30, she had her doctorate, was well respected in her field, but had not experienced much of the rest of life. Cheesy made the call and we were told it would be a 5-minute wait. Our instructions were to meet the car in front of the building. We picked up our bags and as we brushed past the magician I didn't get to see, I put a few dollars in his hat because I had enjoyed the show even if from a distance. He nodded at me as we left the building and I felt he was more aware of me than I thought he should be. It wasn't even 5 minutes before a huge black stretch limousine pulled up at the curb. The back door opened and out stepped the most vivacious raven-haired beauty with astounding green eyes that I had ever seen. I think it was a shiver that ran up and down my spine. She approached us and looked me in the eye. She said, "You shouldn't be having those kinds of thoughts, you don't even know me." And everyone laughed. I don't think she had to be a mind reader to make that statement. That had to be Darla. It was confirmed when she introduced herself and directed us to pile into the limo. There's lots of room for 7 in the back if we squeeze in. And she looked at me. I think just to make Cheesy jealous because then she looked at him and he got the shiver. And a fully stocked bar is at your disposal, she finished. Marius told me later that there were so many abandoned luxury items around after the Soviet Union fell that these kind of limos were a dime a dozen. One day he went into a shop in town and there hanging on the wall as a decoration was a Rembrandt. It wasn't a fake. We all got into the back of the limousine with Darla getting in last and having to squeeze in between Cheesy and myself. The next hour took us along Highway 17 through the town of Iestri where we climbed higher into the Carpathian Mountains. Darla informed us the river we kept crossing was the Moldova River. She added, "Today we are in Romania, but this is a historical region known as Moldavia." The Moldova River is the right tributary of the river Siret, which falls from the Obchina Ferideu mountains of Bukovina in Suceava County. The river Moldova joins the Siret River in Cotu Vames, then flows onto the Black Sea. This was an important route historically. We passed through towns with difficult names to pronounce let alone remember, but I believe Darla announced Pahinosh and Palara Makalui. The next road was narrower and wound its way through higher elevations taking a feng shui approach. The forest was dense in this area with a canopy reaching over the road supported by massive deciduous trees. In winter the approach wouldn't have this leaf cover I thought. Then I thought again, why am I thinking about defending this place? Cheesy has me thinking it's Castle Cel Tradit when it's probably just a really nice house. Mind you we are close to Transylvania where such places exist in old horror movies. We reached a plateau and I could see an opening in the forest ahead with sunlight streaming in from above. The car broke through the forest cover and emerged on the edge of a massive, manicured lawn. Crowning the hill was Castle Cel Tradit. Cheesy was so right. The circus had been good to the Jacks and their family over the centuries. Describing this place was like watching the first 10 minutes of any horror film made about vampires, werewolves, or mummies. It was all stone, with 3 or 4 floors and turrets extending out in every direction. I could only imagine how many rooms were in that place. Was Vincent Price going to come out and escort us in? The vista was breathtaking from that vantage point which was at the highest elevation for a great distance. Although these were not the Himalayas, they did eventually end in the Alps in Switzerland which I was very familiar with. Alpine habitats reminded me of where I grew up but not necessarily where I called home. That wasn't quite an alpine habitat but a dense forest that sheltered thousands of peering eyes. A definite mystique hung about this place. In fact, all of Romania was beginning to give me the willies. A stream of young people flowed out from within the building to unload the car and transport our belongings elsewhere. All we had to do was carry ourselves through the large double doors to the front hall and absorb the sight before us. Marius, Marian, and Uncle Sandu were waiting to greet us as their kin scurried about performing the duties. I've arrived at expensive hotels that didn't provide the level of service we got there. The hall was several stories high with large double doors leading off to rooms on the sides and stone stairways heading both up and down. Chandeliers hung above ornately framed portraits of ancestors that flanked our route as we weaved a path over plush carpets from the Ottoman Empire through a sea of occasional tables laden with medieval European artifacts and trinkets. "Welcome to our humble home." Uncle Sandu greeted us with his arms in the air and a huge smile on his face. After pleasantries were exchanged, Uncle Sandu had various people assigned to take us to our rooms and we were to come back in an hour for the tour before sitting down to dinner. The young lady escorting us introduced herself as April Anapov, so I asked her, "You're not a Cel Tradit?" To which she curtly replied, Uncle Sandu told me you are learning about DNA. You should know you can't always tell a book by its cover. My mother is Uncle Sandu's sister, and my father is General Alexei Anapov, ex of the Soviet Union and 1972 Olympic gold medal in the pole vault, and all I could say was, I stand corrected like a man in orthopedic shoes. April led us up a stone stairway and took the left ascent. This is the guest residence wing for visiting students, teachers, and various performers who come here to become stars in the Cel-Tradit circus. Of course, add friends of the boss and family too. Eventually we arrived at our rooms, and she dropped us off one by one, beginning with me. The room was nice but not overly elaborate. A double bed, a chest of drawers, a full-length mirror and a chair beside the table and lamp. The window had its shutters closed, so I opened the modern glass window installed in front of them and then pushed the shutters open. What I saw blew me away. This window had a panoramic view of the entire valley that it faced. The hills rose steeply on either side to focus your view straight down the valley. I could have pulled up a chair and sat there all day. Perhaps I can get a view of this when I meditate in the morning, I thought, and tried to capture a mental image. I hadn't brought an extensive wardrobe of fancy dress clothes with me because I didn't anticipate that was a necessity, so I had to dress casually for everything. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I realized how underdressed I was. I should have known. The Jacks are all about style when they're in the circus world. Cheesy and I were the only two that were casual. Ian and Sandy looked like they could have met the Queen, Dick and Dr. Sue were dressed for their proms, the Jacks wore Armani suits, and Uncle Sandu could have been the maitre d' at the finest restaurant on the Riviera. Cheesy and I looked at each other and tilted our heads with a shrug our shoulders. What are ya gonna do? I asked. He replied, if we were at a rock concert they would be out of place. Magda and Krista took turns leading the tour and giving us a Cel-Tradit history lesson that could have been a history lesson for this part of the world. Magda, Krista, and Darla looked very similar in build and complexion, but Magda had startling blue eyes that were almost iridescent, while Krista had deep brown eyes almost primal like a tiger. Add to that Darla's green eyes and I thought they must be contact lenses. In all the time I was at Castle Cel-Tradit I couldn't get anyone to confirm or deny that they were. Even in whispered tones nobody could or would tell me. I did learn that Darla was the oldest and that Magda and Krista were twins just 13 months younger. They were younger than the Jacks, but older than the next oldest brother, Henry. I didn't want to ask the Jacks, Uncle Sandu or Cheesy, for fear my interest might be misconstrued or inferred along lines I didn't want to pursue, at least not at that time. The Jacks were sons 6 and 7, in no specific order. So, I asked Uncle Sandu where the rest of the family fit in. Apparently, the oldest son Stefan Cel-Tradit managed the circus on the Eastern Run, which went to Moscow and St. Petersburg. The next elder brothers managed the other two routes, Darian and Anton. Brothers Nikolai and Joseph were killed in an accident many years ago when Marian and Marius were just 6. There was also Stephanie and Maria, they are also older than Marian and Marius. And I thought, that's a big family by my standards. 13 children was a normal-sized medieval family that would lose a few at birth, a few to wars and a couple to disease and disaster. We passed portraits of all the famous Cel-Tradits, some of which I was already familiar with from the first time I met the Jacks and Uncle Sandu. From the earliest Cel-Tradit, Caesarea, to Alan Cel-Tradit and of course, Darian Cel-Tradit. His portrait had a special place of honor because he received this castle from Ivan the Great. We continued into the library where pictures of Petra and Mate Cel-Tradit were displayed along with another Mate Cel-Tradit. Magda explained that, over the years, there were many Cel-Tradits with traditional names like Mate and of course, Darian was popular as well. The gym area had current pictures of recent family members that had passed away but would have been known to everyone as father or grandfather, mother or grandmother. These pictures had a special place in their daily lives, so they would always be a part of it. I saw Danut and Tavarius but not Ivan. The gym itself was extremely well equipped with every modern device you could think of. The ceiling must have been 6 stories high in one area and had trapeze swings attached to it. Floor mats lay around everywhere and lots of athletes were still working out as we passed through. There seemed to be big windows with vista views of the forest everywhere. Great places to meditate and exercise when the sun was right, I thought. They even had handball rooms which Krista said were always busy because it was a favored sport. In fact, I had seen people playing outside against a wall. Adjacent to the gym was a small infirmary where sports medicine was administered to the wounded athletes, enabling them to return to their acts. Magda told us that sometimes it took up to a year to recover from a serious circus injury. Marian said, it's like a rodeo injury with broken bones and rehabilitation. This year we've added a yoga routine to the programs. The next room was a lounge where Krista informed us they entertained family and friends on special events. This was a good room for us to escape to if we wanted a quieter environment during our stay. The bar was fully stocked, and we were welcome to sample any of the vintage liquors they had acquired from an array of monasteries throughout Europe and Asia over the centuries. Krista said, the Benedictine was a particular favorite of my father, Tavarius. There was more here to see than we'd been shown, but the tour ended there, and we were dropped off at the dining room entrance. On our entry into the room, a young fellow seated at the table jumped to his feet and exclaimed, Gorgonzola, you smelly chunk o' cheese. Marion looked him in the eye, and I heard him whisper, would you like to be tied up smelling your own asshole for the rest of the night? That immediately silenced him with an honest look of fear on his young face. I learned who Henry was very quickly. Cheesy just shook his head. I thought Sandy's dining room was posh, but this dining room was pimped out, as little Henry would probably say, the obnoxious little dickhead as Cheesy and I came to call him. I told Cheesy, Henry and Richard will become fast friends, you wait and see. Again, a shiver. Either that place was drafty, or it had me on edge and the future was reaching back to poke me. I don't know which, but I had a shiver that couldn't be shaken. Placards were set on the table indicating our seats, so we shuffled around until everyone found their places. At the head of the table was Uncle Sandu and at the opposite end was Baroness Geraldine Sell-Tradit, the matriarch of the family and mother to the Sell-Tradits at the table, other than Uncle Sandu. That made me wonder, what's the structure of this family and who manages all of this wealth? I thought it was the Jacks at first, but the events of the day have set my pendulum of wonder swinging with multiple possibilities. I asked Marion about his mother later that evening and he told me she was Norwegian by birth and her grandfather was part of the royal family. Her title was Baroness. Apparently, the family was having problems with the Soviet Union and Stalin over some disputed territory that dated back to the 1500s. Marion told me, my father was able to produce a treaty from our archives that granted the land to Norway as a gift from Ivan the Terrible. Mother's grandfather was so happy that he granted my father any wish he could desire. My father used that wish to ask for my mother's hand and it was granted. I had to choke back a tear at the thought of such family history I was missing out on. I wondered who else had titles. Ian told me his father actually had many lesser titles that came with the lordship. If he wanted, he could allow his eldest son, in that case Ian, a courtesy title such as Earl. The only distinction is that Ian could not be called the Earl. That kind of thing appealed to Richard but not Ian. Like Sir Malcolm and Lord Andrew's title, he declined the honour. As we moved from Baroness Geraldine on one side to Uncle Sandu, Ian was strategically next to Baroness Geraldine to put our best foot forward. He was flanked by Sandy on the other side to regale her with Indian mythology and stories of the gods and goddess. The next pair had Marius and Marion opposite each other with Dick and Dr. Sue next to them. It was safe to put Richard in the middle of the table paired with Henry on the other side. Aunt Alexandria, Uncle Sandu's sister, was paired with her daughter April as a further buffer to Richard. April was next to her brother Alexei seated across from Magda. My seat was next to Magda and across the table from Krista. Cheesy and Darla were paired next to Uncle Sandu. The table was set, the guests were seated, and the food began to arrive. The hum of idle chit-chat between neighbors mixed with the consumption of the fabulous meal that arrived in waves and was deposited in front of us. As the conversation turned to the Salton Sea, Ian asked Dick if there was any news and a hush fell on the table. Dick began, as I was telling the Jacks, and he was abruptly interrupted by the Baroness who chastised him. If you're referring to Marius and Marion, you will address them by their names and not those silly circus titles. To which Dick replied, sorry, my mistake. And I thought she had the wrath of Kali in her at that moment, very decisive. Considering his words more carefully, Dick continued, Grandfather told me they were successful in acquiring the funding they applied for under the Sonny Bono bill in the House of Representatives. It'll provide up to $380 million for early construction funds. The local government has already hired a Dutch firm to build steel seawalls all around the area that will be the final walkway. It's over 100 kilometers around the area that will be enclosed as the new Salton Sea. With less and less water in the sea every day, construction is moving right along. Grandfather says the Dutch firm is way ahead of schedule because they've never built a seawall from the seaside. On the Mexican side of the border, they've begun to deepen the Laguna Salada to hold enough water for all the needs in that area and perhaps export desalinated water to San Diego. Dad has a Mexican construction company that's doing the work at favorable rates and providing the financing. They won't require a seawall because they aren't exceeding the surface level of the surrounding area. That started a lot of whispered talk around the table between those who knew of the Salton Sea project and those who were hearing about it for the first time. Richard changed the topic by asking why the family chose the circus business, and Uncle Sandu replied, the circus is essentially a visual performing art unfettered by language barriers. Can a Romanian clown make a Russian Cossack laugh? Can a triple flip on a trapeze make a Ukrainian gasp? Can a trained tiger leaping onto a box on command amaze a young Georgian? Of course, they can. The circus can go anywhere and be appreciated without need to speak the language. The cell traders learned this centuries ago and embarked on extensive international tours throughout the Soviet Union and beyond. Everywhere the train can go in the Soviet Union, so can the circus. There are many towns in Siberia who wait for the circus to come once a year. It can come by train and set up a big festival, then leave. In many places the roads are only accessible a couple times a year, and this is the only annual event they have. People travel for days to see the circus. Then Richard made the comment, "The Cirque du Soleil presents a fine performance. I've seen him several times in London." To which Uncle Sandu replied, "Cirque du Soleil is a contemporary circus with amazing visual arts. In another 300 years they may even create a tradition. Even Circus Krone is only 100 years old. The Moscow State Circus has several wonderful circuses like the Circus Nikolin and the Bolshoi Circus. The Chinese acrobatic acts that perform in the Chinese tradition of Ma Shi, or hippodrama acts with no live animals used, are sights that must be seen to be appreciated. It's like you have taken a drug and entered a fantasy world." And to be truthful, that's exactly what happened 100 years ago. With the audience in a receptive mood, you can transform their minds to see incredible sights. The Chinese State Circus is amazing, drugged or not. April was extolling the virtues of Lake Baikaz. The Baikaz Gorge is part of the country near Nemt and Harghita. It is part of the Hyela Baikazului Hazmas National Park. The gorge was cut out by the waters of the river Baikaz and has great rock climbing walls in many different spots on the lake. There are many such gorges in Romania, but Baikaz is the best and only 80 kilometers from here. April and Alexei loved rock climbing and spelunking. We finished the meal and were directed to the lounge for after-dinner drinks. Uncle Sandu informed us, over the centuries the cell traders have visited many places and sampled many delicacies. Darian Cell Tradit had a taste for liqueurs, so he began developing a cellar of the best liqueurs he could find. Did you know whiskey was invented by medieval Irish monks? And I don't think anyone in this particular crowd knew that. He went on to say, Chartreuse is considered the world's best liqueur by some experts due to the spectrum of distinct flavors that can be observed by the human palate. We have an array of Chartreuse made at different times over the centuries by different sources. It was perfected by the Carthusian order almost 300 years ago, and the recipe has remained a secret. Now that I must try," said Richard with more enthusiasm than I had heard from him in a long time. My personal favorite was the Benedictine DOM. Created in 1510 by an Italian Benedictine monk by the name of Dom Bernardo Vincelli as a tonic for his patients. There are many vintages that go back to the 1600s and are stored in casks in the cellar. I've had the luxury of sampling more than a few, and I will recommend to you a 1732 that we have, which embodies the real essence of what Benedictine should be. One liqueur you may not be familiar with is a cherry brandy known as Marasca. The Dominican apothecaries created this in the 16th century, he said while holding a decanter in his hand which I assumed held the liquid in question. It has a very unique flavor and an oh-so-sweet taste that remains on your palate for quite some time. Do not get a hangover on this one, my young friends. And just to show the depth of the cellar, Uncle Sandu showed us a bottle of Carmelite water created by nuns known as the Carmelite Sisters. They were unknown to all of us with the exception of Richard. This topic was very much up his alley, and he and Uncle Sandu sampled the night away. I think Uncle Sandu was intrigued by how different Richard and Ian were. Marion called our attention to the center of the room where Darla and her sisters were going to perform for us. We gathered around, finding comfortable vantage points. Each of the sisters had a pet. Darla had Mr. Whiskers, a ne'er-do-well cat. Magda had a small dog with big googly eyes called Peepers, while Krista's raven was known as Thief and lived up to his name every chance he got. Magda sat in a chair in the middle of the floor with a cello in front of her, while Darla and Krista placed tubes about 1 meter high and almost as wide around her in a circle. Magda began to play a cello piece that was wonderfully melodic and soulful. A tube was moved to a position in front of Magda. Out from the tube popped Mr. Whiskers, and just as quickly he disappeared down one of the other tubes. Then out of the same tube popped Peepers, who scurried off to find himself another tube. But the tube he chose was already occupied, and Thief flew out and straight down the tube in front of Magda. For the next 2 minutes the animals were popping out of tubes, bumping into each other, trying to get away, while all the time Darla and Krista were pretending to catch them by moving the tubes, while Magda kept playing and accelerating the tempo. Then suddenly the cello started making strange sounds and the melody was shattered. Krista and Darla came over and looked at Magda, who looked back at them as if to say, "What's going on?" She stopped playing and banged the side of the cello with her hand. A meow came from inside the cello. The girls looked at each other as if they were puzzled. Magda spun the cello around and opened a small door at the back of the instrument, and out strolled Mr. Whiskers, who promenaded around in front of the audience with his tail in the air collecting his applause. Peepers came up to take his bow with Thief stealing a ride on his back. We all applauded and laughed. It was a great performance. Even the Baroness had to smile. As people eventually drifted off to bed, Marius invited us to visit the study. My father created this space so that he could contemplate serious questions and have some solitude back in the day. It has a library of the books that were important references to him, as well as being a sanctuary where he wouldn't be causally disturbed by one of a dozen different children. My father was an approachable man, but when things required reflection, he would come up here and we knew he was not to be disturbed. He didn't spend a lot of time here, just important time. Sandy, Ian, Cheesy and I followed the Jacks up a staircase to the second floor, down a corridor and then up another staircase to a third floor. The doorway opened to a room right out of some supervillain comic book. Superman would be redesigning the Fortress of Solitude if he saw that place. The windows must have been 4 meters high and 8 meters across. Their view opened onto a vista that would take your breath away. A full moon and a clear sky. Millions of stars populated the heavens, laid out in their constellations on a Milky Way background. The mountains and valley created hundreds of pockets of mystery to be scanned and studied in the moonlight. This was wolf country, or perhaps a good night for vampires. Marion told us, "Oh yeah, sometimes we sit on the terrace on a night like tonight and listen to the wolves for hours. We listen to them hunt and communicate with the others in their pack and chase out rivals. Magda can tell you exactly what they're doing, which pack is which, and she is always within seconds of the kill or a close call and escape." Marius said, "You should experience it some night before you go. She has an extraordinary connection with all animals and the forest in general, but wolves are her specialty because she grew up with them and studied them like friends." Just like Marion and I, the girls had to specialize in various skills to enhance their circus persona. Ian had stopped off at his room to pick up the puzzle box, which he passed around for each of us to give a closer inspection. When we were finished, Cheesy took the box to be the first to have a try at solving it. There were 4 slides on the top and 4 slides on the bottom. The combination required multiple advances of each slide in order, it appeared. Additional levers may appear that you have to watch for, but none were apparent at the start. Marion informed us that the next day we would get to see some of the important books in the library and start the search of the basement levels. There's one room dedicated to books of an occult nature where you might like to start, depending on what you're looking for. The documents in that room include grimoires of spells, conjurations, natural secrets, and ancient wisdom. Their origins date back to the dawn of writing, and their history is entwined with mostly Christian religion from this part of the world, but science as well. Richard would love those, but I'm sure Henry will be his personal guide. Marius told us, some books took a monk an entire year to copy, and then another monk took over the engraving of the images. Monasteries couldn't produce books fast enough, so when the printing press came in it was a real boon. Many of the documents in this collection have very few copies and fewer accurate copies. Only a select few people could read in those days, and probably fewer people can read the language they're written in today. Marion explained, a grimoire is a book of spells or a textbook of magic, if you like. If it is a good one, it will include instructions on how to create magical objects like talismans, charms, and amulets, how to perform magical spells, or divination methods to predict the future. The 6th book of Moses, for example, is a magical text that was allegedly written by Moses and was supposed to be a book of the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps the church knew it was counter to their best interests, so decided not to include it in the final printing. If you can talk to God directly, then you may not require the church's services. It's one of the founding texts of Rastafarianism. I'll bet Bob Marley has a copy of that book. Marius continued, the 7th book takes events of Moses' life and gives a reputed pairing of an incantation and a drawn magical object, called tables. There are 12 tables, each said to control powers associated with certain angels, elements, or astronomical symbols. For example, the breastplate of God spell that Moses and others used to communicate with God shows a series of symbols arranged on a disc, and it has an incantation to be chanted. The English version is provided by interpreters, but would you have to speak the original Hebrew? Who says any god speaks Hebrew? Besides, he should understand all humans, shouldn't he, or she for that matter? You decide which one is valid. They're just examples of how this type of grimoire works, but there are countless variations. We have most of the popular ones, but in truth it's the obscure ones that hold the true secrets. A folded page or two inside another tomb or tucked behind the binding. Those are the pages that hold the true secrets. Ian replied, yes, that's part of it, and that's why we brought Richard to interpret the text. He's very good with Latin, Greek and various ancient Spanish dialects, which should help for anything in the Christian world, not to say he knows all of them. In addition, he's learning Sanskrit specifically to help us, but he is still far from an expert. Richard has a great eye for languages. I think we have more mysteries here to work on. There is the Lord Andrew and Karma puzzle we want to solve, but we are also anxious to help our doctor friends from Windhaven. Dr. Sue is working on finding a way to prevent malaria and Dr. Ben is working on preventing dengue fever. I was hoping you had some documents on Russian phages that we won't find elsewhere. Another puzzle for our consideration is something we call vital force for lack of a better term. Dr. Emily is trying to find a way to measure and harness the part of a person's being that makes the journey when their Atman leaves their mortal self. In the Kikuyu traditions, they provide lots of suggestions as to how age may be a factor, which could mean it's modified by DNA. They also claim that their ancients walk among them. Until we can measure it, it remains invisible just as the ether. That brings us to another opportunity of being here. We're also looking into the ether question as it was understood by Tesla to see if we can measure vital force or at least find a connection. Rare earth elements may be a factor due to their exceptional and unique magnetic properties understood by Tesla. His understanding of Earth's geomagnetic field may be crucial to many of those concepts. Tesla was born in that part of the world and many of his documents which left the States were brought here. Throw in world peace and I think you've a full day's work. Marius proclaimed and we all laughed. But seriously, Marian and I should do the rare earth search because we already use several elements in our act, and we know what to look for. Florin can probably help too with his knowledge. The cell traded diary entries should help us as well. Ian added, Dick and Dr. Sue should focus on the phage research. Perhaps April or Alexei could help if the documents are in Russian. To which Marius replied, April can help you out with that. She's an engineering student at Moscow University. The main focus is the script that Lord Andrew used. Cheesy and I will work with Richard to try to find scripts from any ancient sages or Sanskrit text in general. I realize many of your documents are Russian, but I understand from Uncle Sandu that there were some Arab interactions that may have produced texts collected and sent back from Africa. They could be in any language. Ian then said, of course Sandy will be working with you as well. Marius suggested we assign Darla, Magda and Krista to your group to cover more ground and give Richard something to read as quickly as possible. That leaves me on the Tesla trail, and Marian added, Alexei is well versed in physics. He could be a great help to you and Florin. Sounds like a plan, Ian said, and with that we all drifted off to our first night's sleep in the castle. I spent a moment looking out my window and down the valley. It was a peaceful, quiet night with a warm summer breeze blowing into my room, so I left the window open that night, vampires or not.